Whatever cat comes down the highway of the sort that says you should stand up for yourself, it's exceedingly foolish for me to stand up for myself against the insane criminals in the city of Seattle administration. The horrifying long tales of mutilation, torture, murder, and rape that they are executing from the city of Seattle would take so much time to recount. But you can see they poured an acid on my face. You can see that they poisoned my teeth and that I'm deaf from terror hate crimes. I've reported it to my congressman. I've reported it to the newspapers. I've reported it to persons in the peripheral of my life. I've reported it to medical residency. I've reported it to mainstream politicians. I've reported it to artists who are activists. I've reported it to school administration. I've reported it to Congress. I've reported it to groups supposedly supporting victims of torture. I've reported it to Gallaudet University for the Deaf. No one has ever replied. And despite the lack of reply from administration, from this cult, there has been no end of replies. They murdered two Kennedys with the delivery of a letter from me to the Kennedys after Courtney wrote to me over the death of her daughter Circe, which is related. They raped a girl who dared to teach me sign language. They wanted me kept incommunicado. They ripper murdered a woman I tried to prevent. I knew they were practicing sacrificial homicide and were getting worked up into a heaving frenzy. I was banned from school for trying to protect Shannon Harps, and she was ripper murdered outside of the clubhouse that poisoned me in the mouth. They're circling like sharks in the water because I dared again to talk about the nerve agent I was kidnapped, tortured, and gassed, brutally tortured and gassed. I dared to name Israeli Americans involved, even though they sent me letters laughing in my face, rubbing it in my face, documenting the nerve agent that they used on me. Nobody dares say anything like that because you don't know the excellency of the administration of the Bar Association. I've gone to the mayor, I've gone to the governor's offices, I've talked to everyone I could think of, baseball players. Now, why did I get locked out of any sort of civility? What sort of things did they do? They pushed barbaric dopamine inhibitors on me. Totally senseless, needless blood pressure medicine that chemically castrated, left me anemic with diabetes. They prostituted me by insinuating a call girl who came and got so involved with me that she was professing a desire to be married so that they could trigger a neuroplasm they had implanted and laugh in my face. Boy, did these people love America. I was born in Pittsburgh. My name is as old as Plymouth Meeting. We never owned slaves. So you can't come around with your Superman from German Africa and say you were mean to a black person. I wasn't mean to a black person. We never owned slaves. We tried to escape the British in covered wagons when they starved us during the potato blight, and they came hunting. King Crimson's first album is no uh, odd comic book image. That man screaming with his ears being torn out of his face was inflicted on a child at their behest. They called it Pink Floyd the Walrus. And these murderers sit on high. They pass the torch between the royal class and threaten to break my jaw. What did I do? Absolutely nothing wrong. I tried to go to school. They wouldn't let me go to school. You see the pictures. If you think I look bad now, you should see the pictures from when I was kidnapped and tortured. That's a 50-year-old scar. You should see how badly I looked in the days after they did it. Did they stop? No. They've threatened nuclear reprisals against their own country for even allowing me to speak. And then they say I'm paranoid. What does it have to do with paranoia? I showed you the evidence. It has nothing whatsoever to do with paranoia. It's the evidence. And they garble everything. They're gurus of their franchise, garble everything. They're from Hollywood. Hollywood has no oversight. They have no administration. The fascist and Axis power in Hollywood say it would limit their freedom if we gave any kind of oversight to their cosmic war junta of endless violence, sex, and hatred and evil. They turned me into a comic book image from one of their Marvel Eight Musketeers things, one of their spin-offs. They said Robertson Jeffries, he's the deaf kid who could have saved John Lennon. I got news for you. Hollywood pulled a prank with that Lennon jazz. Lennon's double fantasy was a stepping out routine. He didn't want to be left holding the bag of all of the injuries that he had pushed on our society with his bird brain MK Ultra music and drug advocacies. So he said, I'm going to step out of this crowd. They had a special limousine painted black so that he would get away. And then they said, "Oh, we cremated the body." Ha 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 ha. Ain't they slick? They were planning it all along. And is that why you're locking me out? Well, you got 2 more weeks to see my blog, Story Checks Out, or with all of the evidence. See, that's what scares them. That's what says, "Oh," they say, "No, we can't allow this." He said the forbidden word. Evidence. That's the forbidden word. You're not allowed to say that word. Don't you know what will happen to you in Seattle? Don't you know what administration will do to you if you say the word evidence? God forbid that James Curry should be heard, especially with a wonder word like evidence. God forbid. So, what does the evidence show? For one thing, that biological warfare Mad Hatter Penis Gabriel in Bath with his Slipperman routines about castrating rapists and giving them sexually transmitted diseases was a military plan. Yes, it was. And it was all encrypted in King Crimson's first record, the business about uh, death seeds. And as their subunit, Paul Runko said, the dialectic is established at the outset between paranoia and poison. You remember that song? They were all in it together. They called it pigment and figment. Where do they come from? They come from Hollywood. They go back to the early 20th century with D.W. Griffith, who was meeting with Marinetti, the Italian futurist who introduced him to Mussolini. He made the film Birth of a Nation, which talks about the rise of the invisible empire of the KKK, glorifies it. They were the first use of the burning cross for the KKK. It was adopted from the movie. And he was meeting with the Italian futurist, the fascist Luigi Freddi was the person who welcomed them. And he was a cameraman, he was the eye of the smut. And they were biblicists, of course. So smut to them meant plague. They knew what they were planning. But who was in the know? You had Bly Sanders, but he was so invisible. He was touching base with Henry Miller, Sergei Eisenstein, the Russian epic filmmaker. Henry Miller, who knew Robert Anton Wilson, still alive and well with this creepy anarchic army administration doing Ripper Hatter routines in Seattle. He knew Picasso well. Blythe Sanders worked the parameters. He wrote about D.W. Griffith and about blending reality with unreality, and he lost an arm in World War I, so he knew about the invisible arm. Ouspensky and Houdini knew about the fourth dimensional aspect of cinema and the invisible arm. So they said, let's have an invisible arm. And it was all right there on the tables, on their desks. Sanders used to use a door on two boxes in a barn for his desk. He'd write with his one arm. And they were planning, they were plotting an invisible attack. And who to keep such an invisible attack invisible? Something so obviously being offered with Houdini and the images of Lazarus that they used, and Casper, and the stepping out routine of Lenin. Who but the master of cinema was the best person to keep something like that invisible? You can see it, but you can't find anything about it. It was there. They all knew about it, but never told anybody. They kept it invisible. And cinema used its invisible empire and grabbed us by the throat. That's what they did to JFK. They let him into his cinema show. He couldn't be late for his cinema show. The benefit of Mr. Kite lastly through a hogshead of real fire. They did this deliberately. And then they summoned a little jinx, a little high jinx. They wrote themselves a waiver. They said Queerbait could have saved John Lennon. What were they doing to Queerbait? They kidnapped me and gassed me. They barbarically attacked me from behind. It was like being shot. I weighed 98 pounds. They say, oh, you didn't stand up for yourself at the National Review. From a blindside attack by a fully grown armed man. I'm supposed to defend myself as a 98-pound school child being blindsided. Pesky. So that makes them men. That makes them strong. That makes them marvelous. That makes them wonderful. That makes them king of the hill. That makes them Ichiro. That makes them Roberto Clemente's favorite.